يا ألف أهلا وسهلا فيك رفيق.
فيكي أهلا فيكي.
هلا للكل to the Psychic Militancy podcast. My name is Lara Shiha, and I'm so excited, delighted, honored to be joined by Dr. Ghassan Abu Sittah. Ghassan, you kind of don't need an introduction, I feel like, personally. You've been central to me, to the struggle. I think you're known to many of our listeners, obviously, and perhaps the image for me, this is where I want to start off, that's most seared in people's minds and brains is this press conference that you did after the bombing of Al Ahli hospital, October 17th, 2023. So this is like 10 days into the genocide.
This morning, when I drove into the hospital, I noted how full the hospital courtyard was, with families who had sought refuge inside the hospital, thinking that it would be a safe haven. It's these very same families who are now either dead or critically wounded as a result of this attack. This is a war crime that the world has seen coming. Israel has been warning the entire world that it was going to attack Palestinian hospitals, and it did exactly that. Every Western politician who has declared unconditional support for Israel's war effort on the Palestinian people has the blood of these children on their hands. That unconditional support is what led us to this massacre. What happened today is a war crime, and if the Israelis get away with it again, then more war crimes will be committed and more hospitals will be targeted.
For me, this is an image that should remain imprinted on us. So one of the things that I talk about oftentimes with psychic militancy are the ways in which we need to remain tethered both to the structural violence, but also the ways in which we can sustain the struggle going forward. But for me, there's obviously so much more also to you than this. And, you and I have spent time together in Beirut, in the UK, and recently South Africa. And what really strikes me and why I wanted you to join us on this podcast and really for us to have a conversation is what I see you as embodied about psychic militancy. Like you're somebody who sees the magnitude of suffering. You're never anybody who skips over that. Bilakis, like you're right there. You remind us of all the moving pieces, which I'd love to get into, but you also remain rooted and focused in unbending and truth telling in a Fanonian sense for me. Like, how is it that we can continuously trace the structural logics that can even allow this to happen? For me, that's what a centerpiece of psychic militancy is. So can you introduce yourself a bit and speak about this alignment, just like have listeners sort of hear that side of it from you?
So I am half Palestinian, half Lebanese. My father's family was expelled from Bir al-Saba, which is in South Palestine, became refugees in Khan Yunis refugee camp in 48. My father was that generation that went to the Gulf in the early 50s and built the health system in the Gulf. I grew up in Kuwait. My family, my uncles had been central to the formation of the PLO prior to Fatah. And even my eldest uncle was one of the leaders of the 36th Revolution. And then the second one was one of the founding members of the PLO with Shuqairi. And so the family was always very rooted in the Palestinian struggle. And so although overtly my father was against our involvement in politics as such, the house was extremely politicized nonetheless. I went to Scotland in 88 to study medicine, remained there for the duration of my undergraduate and part of my internship, and then moved down to London for the rest of my work, including the residency and then fellowships afterwards. So that's the kind of story.
Yeah.
Now the journey intellectually is forged by by the Lebanese Civil War, the 82 invasion, the First Intifada, Oslo, and then the Second Intifada, the First Gulf War. And so with each of these involvements, you kind of evolve, you come out of it with a different sense of being.
Yeah. But you know what's amazing about what you're saying is that you're trained as a physician, I'm trained as a psychologist. You're talking about it, and I've come to know you this way. Of course, this is part of why I find such synergy with you in a very matter-of-fact way. Like, this is the history of struggle that I come from. This is the history of both our peoples. And so, of course, I'd be engaged in this. But we both know that our fields actually work against that. Like, part of what our disciplines do is to discipline us out of locating ourselves within those histories. So, like, that's part of what I have found so compelling about you and your engagement. It's not just being in Gaza and being a mouthpiece to constantly remind us about the layers of violence that are happening, which didn't start on October 7, 2023, of course. That is a huge part of this, but also your unwillingness, like your militant sort of refusal to get dislocated from that history just because you're a physician.
I mean, for me, it goes back to this idea of sociogeny and seeing the clinic as the coalface in which you are seeing the materialization of oppression, of economic oppression, of political oppression, of imperialism as a power, of coloniality as a being, and seeing how that materializes in human pathology, in illness, in injury, and using that really vantage point, because I believe that the clinic does more than just, it amplifies power. It amplifies what you see, it amplifies the effects, it almost creates a kind of magnification. If you have the right ideological and theoretical tools that to use as lenses to see the patients and the way power is encrypted in the bodies of patients and in the pathologies of patients. The most obvious is injury, war injury, but other pathologies of that encryption of colonial power. And coming from it, understanding a bit more after each war and searching for answers after each war. And so with each engagement, you get closer, because clinically you get more experience, and so you're able to move closer to the subject. And the experience allows you to read more, to see more, to use more theoretical lenses, to see the dimensionality of what you're looking at, to see the colors of what you're looking at.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
I mean, the superstructure at the very beginning was Marxist in nature. But then I felt that the superstructure is there, but you want the nuance, you want the details, you want the color, you want the three-dimensional picture. While totally accepting the superstructure, but needing more to understand that day-to-dayness of how oppression is embodied into my patients' lives and my patients' biological being.
Right. Not as an after effect. I mean, this is the thing. One of the things I love about how you talk about it is that you are very clear that these things are central to the machinery of violence, whether that's settler colonialism or capitalism or imperialism, rather than an after effect, which a lot of times when we think about health effects, the way that it's written about, the way that people are given money to study about this is like the effects of such and such and such, right? As like somehow this is something that happens after the fact and it's separate from, but you have been very precise in locating this as a centerpiece of the machinery of violence.
Injury, either direct physical traumatic injury or illness as a form of injury, is central to the machinery of oppression. because it aims to do several things. It aims to break people. It aims to create a level of alienation that's beyond Marx's alienation of labor. And I think beyond even, I mean, Fanon saw it because he was a psychiatrist, but I think there's a much more, I mean, physical, or at least from my experience as a reconstructive surgeon, physical injury creates a level of alienation that is so fundamental. And so you need to be able to see that and understand it so that you can help the patient. I mean, the idea is that none of this is superfluous to your basic aim, which is that you're there to undo some of the damage that is done on your patients. But in order to do that, you need to understand why it's done and how it's done.
Right. Right. To track the process rather than like focus just on the content, like okay, here are the after effects of it. What you're saying is like there's a whole history, a social relation behind this that is actually center to this actually happening. The possibility of Al Ahli Hospital being bombed, the possibility of the types of injuries you were seeing could not have come into being without the machinery to begin with.
Absolutely. And without it being part of a project, but part of the healing, the disalienation, I mean, to step back, there's nothing more fundamental when people can no longer recognize their own bodies as a result of injury, as a result of facial deformity, and they literally cannot recognize their bodies, or as a result of musculoskeletal injury where they're alienated from the functions of their body. And therefore, if your job as a reconstructive surgeon is to return as much form and function, which is the definition of plastic reconstructive surgery, you need to understand that. And you need to understand that only through creating an alliance with the patient are you able to take them on a very painful, very long journey that never ends at 100% return of form of function, but through an alliance with the patient who recognizes you not as a dominant individual who represents power, but actually as an ally on their side. In pushing back the power of injury, in pushing back the power of coloniality that pervades the clinic, in pushing back all of these oppressive mechanisms, that you can take this patient back to a process of disalienation, even with the remnants of the injury that they have.
Right. Yeah, it's not about disconnecting them from that. I love how you're laying this out for us, because I feel like it speaks against a sort of ableist notion of what we're talking about, restoring form or any of that.
And also an instrumentalist view of medicine.
Yes.
That we're just basically human body car mechanics.
Yes.
And that once you put people together again, then that ends. And it also has to do with that instrumentalist view in failing to understand that injury is physical, emotional, psychological, social, and existential. People are existentially injured in war, because when they're injured in war, they're not injured in isolation.
Right.
And you add that existential injury to a historical injury that's composed of a multitude of individual injuries that constitute these patients' lives.
That's also pointed. I mean, part of what you're, it's what you are sort of speaking against is somehow this idea that there's a pure form to return people to. Because if we're talking about the condition, if you were talking about it as like an alignment with your patient, which I'm reading it as you're talking about a political alignment, there's a political alignment to liberation and understanding the conditions of injury as being part of the machinery to move people away from that liberation or derail them from that commitment fully. One of the things is in politically aligning with our patients, it's also about remaining tethered to if there's a trauma, if there's a bodily harm that's happening, if there's a pathology in the ways that our fields both understand that, is that there is a political project to point to that is the cause of this, right? And I'm not saying that people are just circumscribed by the conditions of their trauma. They're not just helpless victims, but there is something about being very precise about all the conditions that cause this and the ways in which we can join, right? And here I'm taking back to Fanon. What are the ways in which we can be held responsible to use the resources that are available to us as quote unquote professionals in our discipline to make this political alignment happen? What you're saying is that this is center to the struggle. This is not separate to that.
Absolutely. I mean, I think because of the nature of the intimacy and the fundamental way medicine is able to touch people's lives, because it touches their very biological being. Unless the clinic becomes what Fanon called the world of you for the patient, then you are unable to create that alliance between you and the patient. The patient needs to feel that the clinic has become liberated from the power that injured them, the power of coloniality that manages the clinic, the power of all of these powers that the patient understands implicitly and intrinsically. And unless that happens, then you are unable to create, and then you replicate, that you become just another layer of injury. Even if physically you manage to do exactly the same result,
right?
You forego all of the other injury, and the patient comes out with the similar result, having felt defeated by the injury rather than empowered, or at least felt that there was a point and a space that was created for them.
Right.
And it's almost like the critical aspect of this is very similar to in feminist discourse hostile spaces. I've seen clinics where the majority of clinics where the clinic is a hostile space for the wounded, for the war wounded, having worked in the same hospital, having worked at Shifa Hospital during the second Intifada when the Palestine Authority was running the Ministry of Health, and then having worked in it in the 2014 war, and 2009 war, and 21, and you realize that hostile space can change because it's a hostile space based on political projects and power.
You're rooting us back in Gaza, and that's kind of I want us to go there, because one of the things you said is that you kind of learn from the field. And here I'm using this as a, as an obvious sort of being in the field, being in the struggle. Again, sort of looking to Che, whether it's through his piece on revolutionary medicine about despecializing, or Fanon, we have many examples of this, but I'm wondering if you can give us more texture, like what did this look like, your practice? And I hear you saying that you've learned from this. You were able to sort of attach an analysis and a structural component to this. I think part of it is it's naturally there in your political inclinations, but sort of connecting theory with praxis is something you've done actively. It's a political commitment that I know from you, that I learned from so much. But if we're to root ourselves in Gaza, what does that look like, both in terms of what folks are up against in terms of this injury you're talking about? I've heard you talk about this in terms of the biosphere of genocide, and we can certainly go in that direction. But then also, what are some examples of making that alignment happen? Like, how does that happen for folks? One of the things I've been struck with is hearing from you in the times we've spent together is that we don't know even a fraction of the real texture of what's happening. And I kind of want to offer some of that for folks to really be able to chew on and really understand the magnitude of this.
So the issue in Gaza, not just in this war, but in previous wars, is that at the very first moment that you have any interaction with the patient, the language, and the language is a weapon of violence, and it's a weapon of alliance,
Yeah.
and it's a weapon to deepen alienation, and it's a weapon to disalienate people.
Yeah.
The language that you would use with the patient, the affect that you have with the patient, your ability to deal with not just the patient as the individual, but as the social and as the historical, to listen to the patient, to have interactions with their families. Nobody is claiming that you are going to undo the injury that has happened, that has brought this patient. But what you're doing is, again, you're trying to have yourself on the side of the patient against that power. And the moral abyss that humanitarianism has fallen into is this duplicitous concept of neutrality.
Yeah.
Because neutrality assumes that power doesn't exist in the clinic. But power in the clinic is the oppressive power. It's the power to injure. And potentially, the power to injure becomes embedded in the clinic, and therefore the treatment experience becomes another layer of injurious power. And therefore, you need, as I was saying at the very beginning, the thing about the clinic is it amplifies power.
Right.
It amplifies power in terms of oppressive power, and you see it in the injury. The physical manifestation of ethereal power becomes to you as symptoms and as signs and as patient narrative about unwellness. But it also amplifies resistance to that power because of its proximity to life, to death. And there's a reason why the Israelis insisted during this war on turning Shifa Hospital and Nasser Hospital into mass graves, where the bodies were buried in the courtyard of the hospital. The same reason people were killed inside Al-Ahli Hospital. It is to try to, it's a recognition of the centrality of the space of the clinic to the struggle. And it's an attempt to turn that from a space in which the power of death and the necrotrophic, not necropolitical, but the necrotrophic politics of injury as a form of value creation for capital is resisted. And so you'd want to turn that space of healing and resistance into a site of permanent death, into a site in which there is a mass grave.
Right.
We know that in every other massacre globally, the first thing the perpetrator does is he takes the bodies, puts them in a truck, and dumps them somewhere very, very far. Never to be seen. It took the teams looking for the remains of the Srebrenica victims over 10 years to find the bodies. But in Shifa and in Nasser, they were left in the courtyard with a very, very shallow covering of sand, because they had to be found there. They had to be.
The spectacle was part of it.
It's critical part of delineating this space and claiming it for death rather than for life, claiming it for oppressive colonial power rather than for the power of resistance.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I've heard, and this is, I think, part of what's so powerful about what you're saying, what I've heard you talk about before, is this is the importance for me when I think about psychic militancy. It's all these ways in which we remain precise about all the moving pieces, because sometimes we can feel like, well, this is pedantic, or we're just saying something that's obvious. But part of what you're saying to us is actually all the ways in which this becomes obscured, and how our fields are actually joined in that obstruction of seeing this as central, not as a secondary thing, right? Because the way sometimes I hear about it talked about, which you're saying flies in the face of it, is there was a bombing and then, doctors died, or there was, as part of this, even if it's not in a passive tense, it's almost like it was an after effect. But one of the things I've heard you talk about, and what you're saying here again, is that there's actually a targeting of the potential for people who can be mediators of life,
Yes.
or actually people who can sustain the continuation of life and life sustenance, that they become the target, so that it's actually an amplifying effect. Like, I've been reading counterinsurgency manuals, and they talk about amplifying factors. And one of the things I think about when you talk about the biosphere of genocide and all of this is that becomes an amplifying factor. If you kill doctors,
1,700 health workers,
right,
chosen by AI, a specific software called Where's Daddy,
yeah,
which found them, targeted them, and killed them as a form of amplification. Because we saw from this genocide remains a very primitive endeavor. You know,
right.
it needs epidemics, it needs famine, it needs dislocation, geographic dislocation, it needs racism, it needs denial.
Yeah, yeah.
But what technology has brought in is the identification of points within the genocide that amplify the effect and hasten the killing.
Yeah.
And part of that was the role of AI to identify the doctors and the nurses. When in 1 month, 10 critical care nurses, intensive care nurses are killed, that is not random killing of doctors. That is a specific task of identifying specific junctions in the machinery which you need to speed up.
You're talking about these as like formative nodal points, which for me is just a reminder about the centerpiece of this. I heard you in South Africa speak, and you said something like 900 plus years of medical training has been lost in Gaza, and over 850, I believe, years of nursing training has been lost, right? Let alone the fact that we're seeing healthcare workers, psychologists, psychiatrists, every form of healthcare worker also become political prisoners, right?
Yes.
So for me, this is, it almost feels so obvious, and yet part of the machinery is to make it seem like this is normative, this is natural, this is an after effect. So I wonder if that's also what you're talking about. The disalienation is for us to always center these nodal points, and to bring us back to the claim that you're saying is the clinic is not just political. Like, we have this axiom, right? That the personal is political, and so our work, of course, is political. But you're saying is it's a centerpiece of struggle. It's a centerpiece of resistance.
Yes, absolutely. And we saw this in this war. Never, I think, has there been in the history of wars where the clinic was a central part of the battlefield.
Uh-huh.
And never has there been a war or an anti-colonial war where the clinic was central to aborting the genocidal project and the ethnic cleansing that the genocidal project aims at the end of it. And we saw that even up to the last 2 to 3 weeks of the war before the ceasefire. Had it not been for the decision by the staff of Al Ahli Hospital and what was left of Shifa to remain in Gaza City, the 600,000 would have been driven out.
Uh-huh.
Because it's the way the clinic anchors life into a geographic location that keeps people. And people are not deluded what Al-Ahli and Shifa were able to offer towards the end, but it was critical that they stayed. And they did it consciously. They knew. I've spoken to some of the doctors who stayed in what's left of Shifa Hospital, which is the administrative building that they turned into an emergency department. And they knew if they had left, then the ethnic cleansing of Gaza City would have been much easier.
It's so powerful, both in terms of like, I mean, this is what we mean by Monde. It's not the casual way in which it's being used, right? It's like literally you remain steady, steadfast, refusing to move, with the implications of what that means on a larger social, political, psychic level. Like all I'm feeling and hearing is the reverberations of that. And it's not about deluding oneself into thinking, okay, we're going to be able to rehabilitate the monstrous nature of the injuries, but there's something that transcends that actually becomes central to the life-sustaining effort.
Yes, and it's the fact that it is. It's almost that Fanon's description of the colonial world being divided into two compartments.
Yes.
These two compartments are fighting inside the clinic. And these two compartments are either the clinic becomes the zone of non-being and people are driven out.
Yes.
Or it becomes a site for resisting and for humanizing and for persevering in a the kind of life battle,
right?
I.e., enforcing life, keeping life,
right.
And that's what you get. That's what happened in Gaza. But the question is, and I'm trying to kind of think this through, is this very specifically a genocidal process, or are we witnessing scorched earth policies that initially in the 50s and 60s did this to the countryside because the majority of the global South's population lived in the countryside? And now that the third world lives in urban dwellings like Gaza, like Nairobi, like Kinshasa, like Mumbai, this is what scorched earth is going to look like. Battles inside the life-sustaining geographies, which is the clinic, rather than the paddy field, is the life-sustaining geography. The life-sustaining geography in keeping these. And so the attacks, this is the new war, the war against the urban life infrastructure.
Right. The transformation of the terrain. Here, I can't help but, of course, I mean, when we're talking about Palestine, of course, when we're talking about liberation struggles in general, the issue of sovereignty is at the forefront of my mind, right? So when you're talking about sort of the movement from fallihin to urban space, right? From agriculture to that, from the rural areas, that in terms of food sovereignty, we know how that works. So I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about how health sovereignty figures into this, and how that, we talked about alienation versus disalienation before, but you're giving a different angle here around how we might start to think about health sovereignty and why this type of ferocity against a system that I see in Gaza as actually against, and we don't have to think about against all odds as partially constitutive to what it is, has maintained sovereignty to a large degree. Right. And
why the minute the ceasefire ended, we hear from the Ministry of Health that they're being offered tens of millions of dollars by American and Western international NGOs to buy up the hospitals of the Ministry of Health, even the ones that are just a pile of rubble. Because
maybe especially
the self-determination, particularly in terms of health sovereignty, is critical part of the power. You cannot resist in the clinic if you do not have sovereignty over the clinic. And it's about the sovereignty over the clinic allows you the foothold to start pushing back. If you don't have that sovereignty, you can't even begin to fight back because you don't have a foothold. You can't be there. The clinic is actually then has been swallowed up by the powers that injured the patients who came in.
Right.
You are part of that machinery of injury rather than the machinery of healing. And it's predicated on who has sovereignty over the clinic.
Right. Yeah.
And I saw that again when we talk about the second intifada, but I also saw that in Aden when I was working in Aden. South Yemen is being cannibalized by the Americans and by its regional allies. And when we went to the hospitals, you could see that lack of sovereignty because it was critical that destruction of South Yemen meant that it has zero sovereignty, and therefore that sovereignty should never exist, even inside the clinic. And you felt it. You felt it in the emergency department. You felt it in the hospitals. And one of the, it's not nostalgia, but one of the interesting things is one of the few places which you found a bit of sovereignty and a bit of life was in Aden Medical School, that had been set up by Castro in the 70s and during the lifespan of South Yemen Republic. Cuban professors from Havana would rotate to teach there.
Right.
And it maintains as the only place that has a bit of is able to, but the hospitals, it was awful. You could see the desolation.
Yes. Yeah. It's funny. I don't receive it as nostalgia. I receive it as like a return to where we started, where you were like, needs to be a political alignment, right? To a joining with the patient around the material conditions of their suffering. And if you're having a sort of explicitly political project, like our work is explicitly political, and you and I can, I think, both attest to how hostile our peers, our institutions, the NGOs that we are on boards of, whatever the case is, the moment we make explicit our political commitments, despite the fact that there are historical examples of this, Fanon talked about our necessity to dismantle all the incarcerative elements of care as a necessary part of liberation. But this sort of, diluting and depoliticizing, to me, is part of the counterinsurgent project of the liberal humanist move that fundamentally medicine and psychology are a part of.
Yes, and this view of instrumentalism, that your job is to just put the mechanics of the body back together again, either the mental health or the physical body.
Right.
And not see the human behind the body, and not see the social behind the body. Over the last few days, I've been reading Vincent Navarro and his work in the 70s. And it's enlightening. It just shows how that discourse became erased from the canon.
Yeah.
Completely erased from the canon. And certainly the exact opposite of what he was warning about was entrenched in medical education. That instrumentalism, that domination, medical domination of the patients, that alliance between the ruling class and the medical establishment. Even during the National Health Service, before it was being insidiously privatized.
Right.
Because at the end of the day, what they do not want is that clinic becoming part of the power base of the patients.
Yes. Yeah. People power. Yeah. I love that one of the things that always happens when we're together is you tell me about the things you're reading, and I'm like, in all your free time, you're always still learning, which is, I think, another piece of this is like oftentimes we're drawn into these like continuing education, which themselves are like completely depoliticized. This feels like your political education. Do you want to say a little bit more about Navarro's, like what are the things that are compelling you, are pulling you in, that feel central to the work? And for me, every time you talk about something you're reading, you never separate it from Gaza, from your experiences there, from your knowledge of your colleagues and your comrades on the ground that are still, this is not a bygone, or in Beirut with the beeper blasts, with also the attacks on the healthcare structure in Beirut. So what is it that you're being drawn into when you're reading Navarro in this case?
His insistence that health is social, and that all relations are social, and therefore your relationship with the patient, your relationship with the nursing staff, your relationship with the powers that run the clinic are social relationships that are predicated on power, and therefore it allows you to view. So, I mean, for me, it's always been that these theories. Do you remember the old opticians where they used to put these glasses on for you and they would swing one lens after the other and you would try to read something and then they would cover one up. And for me, these readings have always been, they don't show me something that I haven't seen. What they do is they make me see something that is there more acutely and better, with better visual acuity and all of this. And Vincent Navarro really kind of, for me, applied a very interesting structural and material reading into medicine as a profession.
Yeah.
And the relationship between it and power and health.
Yeah.
So not only, I think that the difference between oppressive medicine and liberatory medicine is in the understanding of the role that power plays in bringing the patient to the clinic and inside the clinic.
Yes.
The way the clinic is a place of amplified power and is actually a place of power struggle.
Yes. Yes. A contested space. We turn it into a contested space.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And unless you win that contest, then your patients will lose.
Sah. This brings me back to the neutrality piece, right? Because the neutrality for me, the myth of neutrality, I will say, which both of our fields really just, live on. They live on the sort of and they will use a misguided thing of like, well, we have a commitment to serve all patients. And I'm like, that's not what fucking neutrality is. No one's saying. Exactly. No one's saying.
Is refusing to change the balance of power between the injuring party and the injured party.
Yes.
So neutrality is basically allowing injury to continue inside the clinic.
Yes, stabilizing it. It's a stabilizing force, right? But I think also you're talking about it in terms of attunement, because when you engage in neutrality in that way, part of the function of that is not just to be like, oh, I'm neutral. It's also to become a proselytizer for neutrality, such that you punish anybody else who refuses to engage in the process of that recalibration of power. And you're with every attunement is a coerced misattunement away from something else.
And I felt it. I mean, when you talk about this press release, within 2 days of the press release, I was asked to leave a medical NGO, British NGO, that I had been the head of the projects committee on and was on the board of trustees on, and then was asked by MSF to stop referring to myself in the interviews as an MSF volunteer. And so
this is Doctors Without Borders, folks.
So that neutrality, as you said, they become guardians of that neutrality. And I can tell you now that from friends who still work in MSF, that the discussions are, we will not be pushing in our communications the issue of accountability on the Israelis, lest we end up on the wrong side of the Israelis and they won't let us back in.
Which is unbelievable, because there's a confession in that. That's the piece that gets me, is that if we are making all those concessions, which we're already ceding so much space. This is you and I have talked about this in South Africa, about the issue of ceding space. I'd love to get into that if you're up for it. But in that statement, there's a confession about who's in power and who's dictating the terrain of our struggle. But then there's a disavowal and a localizing blame in somebody like you. Like somehow it's you saying, Jama'ah, look what's happening. You're turning this into a gravesite. We know who the genocidaires are. Pay attention to this. Every international organization and anybody who dares say they are committed to medicine and healthcare should be here at the podium with us. representing the folks who have been murdered in the name of this genocidal settler state, you become the problem rather than the confession that they're saying.
Yes. But I mean, that proves that actually it's not neutrality. It's ascribing to the dominant power.
Yes, it's an ideological position.
It is completely an ideological position. Right. And they were able to get away with it because these wars were small and they were short and they were basically, there was a kind of localization of that position. Then comes the genocide, and the world discovers that humanitarianism is intrinsic to the genocidal project.
Yeah.
Because it allows the genocidal project to last and outlast outrage.
Yes.
And allows it to last long enough because people feel by donating to these humanitarian organizations that they're fighting the genocide rather than that they need to. So had the humanitarian sector not been in Gaza, and they weren't in Gaza until January 24, had they not been in Gaza, I think the genocide would not have lasted as long.
Wow, that's powerful. You're like, you give it oxygen by this,
absolutely,
this mythical fig leaf. I've heard this talked about in abolitionist social work when it comes to the different form of genocidal warfare in the context of the settler colony of the United States, the detention center for migrants, where people, or in black sites where psychologists are there. And the argument is you lend credibility to these sites by being there rather than saying these sites should not exist to begin with.
These are sites of death.
Right.
And therefore I have no place as someone ascribing to life in being there.
Right.
And I am intellectually honest enough to accept that if Shlomo lets me in, then my presence benefits Shlomo.
I like that you're saying you're intellectually honest enough, because this is part of the issue. The holding that line,
because it's rooted in white saviorism.
Yeah, supremacy.
And so breaking that,
Yes.
And again, it goes back to why Fanon now is more critical than, because at the end of the day, the two issues that face us still are the two issues that he wrote about: coloniality and racism. And the way one feeds the other and the other justifies the other.
Right. And the clinic enshrines it, from what you're saying.
Absolutely.
Right. The ways the clinic enshrines it or becomes a site of resistance against it.
Yes.
Yeah. Maybe this is a good segue into you saying a little bit more about the biosphere of genocide, because this is for me a centerpiece of it. And you know me, I'm always also very much interested in the ways that people continue to refuse and resist, because that is the struggle. It's like, it's for us to track the machinery of violence in the ways that it intends to create wear and tear such that rehabilitation is not possible. Futures are not possible. It's only the future of the settler that we end up sort of investing in rather than the future of the indigenous.
When we were in South Africa, we saw it so clearly that the only beneficiary to the end of apartheid have been the white settlers.
Yes.
They must think if we'd only ended it sooner, the good life would have come earlier.
Anjit. Yeah.
It was really
sobering. It's sobering.
Very, very much so.
Yeah.
So the idea is this, that by destroying the physical, biological, and social, you create a biosphere where people live, where all of these conditions, their social conditions, their physical conditions, their biological conditions, work separately and in synergy to reshape human health in a way that takes lives or diminishes lives. And so, to give you an example, if you look at the destruction of water and sewage pipe, intentional destruction, 340 miles of sewage pipes were destroyed. The sewage treatment plants were destroyed in the first 2-3 weeks of the war. the destruction of the water treatment plants. So you've destroyed the physical. Then you have the epidemics, which we know are critical to every genocide since the invention of genocides. You create one epidemic after the other, then you destroy people's homes, forcing them to live in these cramped schools designed for 1,000 students, not 10,000 internally displaced. Then you create the perfect condition for epidemics that take people's lives. Then you create the famine, which also we know is a critical component of genocide. That famine is like an iceberg. What you see, people dying, but what the rest of the iceberg is malnutrition. Now, malnutrition on its own will not kill you, but if you're wounded or you have an infectious disease, then you'll die of lesser malnutrition and a lesser wound and a non-fatal infectious disease. You also have the phenomena of multi-drug resistant bacteria, where the infections, the wound infections, no longer respond to the antibiotics. And then you look at the social, the destruction of the social, destruction of cemeteries as a way of cutting people from their past so that they're more likely to leave. The destruction of 58,000 orphan children who were left to fend for themselves as children. And we saw this when these feeding stations for the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, they killed 2,300, the majority of whom were teenagers. The reason why there were teenagers is that they were the heads of the household.
Right.
And so you suddenly see the way that the social, the physical, all conspire. Last winter, we had hypothermia, people dying of hypothermia, which doesn't happen because it doesn't get that cold. It's not like the rest of the world. But if you're malnourished and you're wounded, you are going to die at 4 degrees centigrade or 5 degrees centigrade. So these synergistic things. And then you have the amplifiers, the nodal points, killing the 1,700 doctors, blowing up not just random buildings, but making sure that you've destroyed the hospitals. All of this then becomes amplifiers within the biosphere. And then when there's a ceasefire, you can do what the Israelis have done, is sit back and let the biosphere do its good work and prevent the entry of anything that can alter the dynamics of the biosphere, of entry of caravans and housing, entry of food, protein, formula milk. All of this is to maintain that system from being altered by external factors. That's what we're seeing. And now we understand that the Red Indian reservations were a critical part of the genocidal project. Because there will always be in a genocide survivors, and your job is to create a biosphere that maintains genocide, which is what the reservations have been. Which is exactly what Trump's plan is.
Right. That's exactly what I was thinking about. You're talking about the ways in which the conditions of death, right, and waning the ability of people to wage war against that deathscape. Yes. Because if you're incapacitated, you're debilitated, there's spread of disease.
You've lost sovereignty. That's the critical part about the reservation, the difference between the reservation and active resistance is self-determination and sovereignty.
Right. It's sustaining, and this goes back to the idea of sustaining settler futures. Indigenous futures around that. And why the centerpiece, you're bringing us back to why the conversation about the clinic is so central to this. Because the access point, if we're talking about disease as an amplifier, as a centerpiece of this, like as I'm hearing you talk about all of this, I'm coming back to the notion of the amplifiers being the body, the ways in which disease works through the body, the conditions outside that spread disease. And so us actually becoming attuned to that is one way in which we might destabilize the conditions in which the ongoingness nature that is relied on is there.
Yeah. So if
right?
you notice
Yeah, hala. Yeah,
the
hala.
Beirut electricity
I feel at
experience,
home. I feel at home.
the Beirut electricity experience has happened. So
I
let me
love it
just
so much.
create a bit of ambience.
And we really need to keep this in because there's nothing that makes me feel more at home than
Yeah.
electricity outage. I love this. Yeah. So I mean, I get what I was saying is we're back in your whole point about retaining our ability to see why the clinic is centered to this. I feel like this is so important because there's a way in which the world we live in, like reconstructive surgery or plastic surgery or something, which is what your specialty is often talked about as a elective process. And what dominates our idea about this is like, plastic surgery where people enhancement, beauty enhancement. The way you talk about it completely flies in the face of that. And it has helped me see how also there's a way in which medicine is talked about in the mainstream or sort of reduced in this way as actually part of that project of dislocating the clinic from liberation.
Yes. And somehow it's become superfluous in life.
Yes.
Even though plastic surgery grew out of in France, the First World War, a guy called Tessier, who was trying to reconstruct the faces of French soldiers shot in the First World War, and in the UK, Gillies, who was trying to reconstruct the faces of airmen and soldiers whose bodies were either burnt or caught up in the explosives. And so it's always been. But it's the interesting thing is until I started until well into the 2006, 2007, the International Committee of the Red Cross only recognized war injuries as a fresh wound that's no older than 3 months. And that keeping the patient alive is the only job of the war surgery. And so one of the things that I've tried to do academically is advance the idea that reconstructive surgery is a critical component of war surgery.
Right.
And it wasn't the case when I started out.
Right. What's been the reception of that? Because that's a disruption, right? We've been talking about hegemonic ways in which these fields stabilize particular things, not the least of which is the separation of the social and the political from the clinic. Your position here is one that goes back to where we start, is the realignment of the political and the liberatory pieces of this. What's been the reception of your...
It was dismissive, trying to convince these organizations that they need to be providing reconstructive surgery for the war wounded, especially in an area where wars are as a result of imperialism, an endemic disease. They're the cause of ill health in our region, and they happen repeatedly within the lifetime of the same patient, to the same patient, or to the same communities.
Right.
And it took forever to try. And I mean, certainly the first ever attempt by ICRC was in a hospital in Tripoli for the wounded coming from Syria. And in MSF, there was a hospital set up after the Iraq War to do that. And then, so we're talking all beyond 2003. And the first medical textbook called Reconstructing the War Injured Patient, I wrote in 2007, and that was the first ever textbook that provided technical knowledge about how do you reconstruct a war wounded patient.
Right. Talk about deleting stuff from the canon.
Absolutely.
Right. That political project.
Undeserving. It's the undeserving. It's about the racialization of the war wounded patient as being purely, and this is the whole discourse of Trump, that as being purely physiological beings that need to be fed and watered, and that's it.
Right.
So your charity is because they are biological entities,
right,
with no needs other than the basic physiological needs.
Right. This is the rate, and the counterpiece to that in the field of psychiatry or psychology or anything, is like, this is the over reliance on the cognitive behavioral. Like somehow people are just behavioral modification machines. There's no interiority to their being. And there's an invitation for like them being so grateful for the magnanimity of the Savior to come in and attend to these surface level behavioral things. Like, why would you need anything else? And beyond that, I'm thinking here about the beeper blasts.
Yes.
Right. And I've heard you talk about this before, but this feels so central, because part of the violence of this and why this reconstructive surgery becomes a central piece, at least in my mind, and maybe you can help me flesh this out even more as I think this through, is the violence of the colonizer. It's not enough just to destroy, like you're saying in the biosphere. It's also to leave the imprint. Like, if you dare refuse my entry into your psyche, I will leave a mark on you so that you can carry the violence. You can know your place. This is the racism, right? Go back to Fanon. Like, know your place forever, because this is what you will live with. And it feels like part of what you're speaking to is a redistribution of that, and an attempt to sort of collectively attend to these ways in which people otherwise have to carry this with them, coercively.
So it takes us to the idea that why mutilation is so critical to colonial violence. From the branding of slaves to the Congo and the amputation of the hands of the children of farmers, to the marches of return and the shooting of 8,000 Palestinian young men in the legs, and then the pager attack.
Yeah.
And it is the encryption of colonial power on the body of the colonized, so that it's written on that my power is written on your face, it's written on your body. And the job that I saw in the pagers, as in the marches of return, is to undo the stigmata of that encryption of power, whether it's in the faces of the pager patients, in reconstructing their eyelids so that they can wear glass eyes, or in the reconstruction of the limbs of the marches of the return victims, to undo the encryption of power. Because for the colonizer, the colonized needs to be a continuous testament to omnipotence.
Yeah.
The testament to omnipotence. It's almost like Europe started out believing that the European was made in the image of God, and then the European became God as part of the secularization process. Mm-hmm. And the obsession with omnipotence that was done in a kind of kitsch way in Trump's AI video on Gaza with all of the statues. This is him articulating something. And that articulation is that need for omnipotence over the body and the lives and the fates of the colonized.
Right. Yeah, and like you said, for me also, I love what you're saying about the inscription, right, on the body and putting it in its place. It also functions, I feel, like a foreclosure to any other possibilities, because you had said it fundamentally distorts the way that people think about themselves or see themselves or imagine themselves or recognize themselves. And that disruption feels like a psychological, affective, physical stopping up of any possibilities beyond what the colonizer insists on.
So, I mean, one of the reasons why I started looking into alienation and trying to understand it is that I noticed that a lot of my patients, not just in Palestine and in Lebanon, but also in Iraq, particularly the ones with facial deformities, would come to the clinic holding their old photographs and asking to look the way they used to look. And I kind of realized that the height of alienation, beyond the economic alienation and psychic alienation, is when you no longer recognize your exterior, your body, your skin. And what is critical about the work that we have to do, and why it's critical that it's done in a clinic where the patient is freed from the oppression of the clinic, is to, as part of the reconstructive surgery, to change the social connotations of these stigmata so that they mean the exact opposite.
Right.
That they mean the resistance of the patient to the power that inscribed its signature on their body.
Yes.
But that is a journey that is both physical, psychological, and social and historical.
Yes.
Trying to get them to view their wounds with pride rather than with a sense of either guilt or shame or alienation.
Sah, yeah. And in many ways, I feel like, we see this in folks who are linked up with the struggle. I mean, Rita Jackaman has been talking about this for ages. People who are connected to political struggle, to political movements, are much better able to sort of understand and move through and navigate the oppressive conditions on which they're under. When Save the Children goes into Palestine and does PTSD work with children, dislocates them from who causes the demolition, we actually see an increase in PTSD symptoms, right? This is a great example of that. So part of what I'm hearing when you talk about that is that these ideas of pride and sort of holding it as a connection, that being tethered to the resistance, in many ways already exists in the communities with whom we work. Part of the struggle of the clinic is not to almost cause alienation, which I do think is the counterinsurgent prod. It's a causing of alienation rather than a joining. And maybe this is like Martin Baro style of like, people know their conditions, and it's incumbent upon us to actually create the ways in which we work alongside them to uplift their revolutionary fervor rather than to derail it, which is what modern medicine,
or even worse, to internalize it,
right,
and to atomize it, or to create, to isolate patients,
right,
from their communities.
Yes.
Pathologize.
Yes. Yeah. You have a book coming out, yeah?
it's I seem to kind of, the term in Arabic, الهروب إلى الأمام. Every time I sit down to write a bit more, I feel that I need to kind of read more.
Yep.
But yes, hopefully,
yes.
Liberation medicine.
Yes. So this is, I'm thinking about that because this feels like all the things we've been talking about, I hope will find their way into the book for folks. And do you want to tell people who's it with, when it might be coming out?
Hopefully going to be with Penguin Random House.
Wonderful.
And we're looking at a year.
Okay. Yeah.
We're looking at a year.
In all your free time, Ghassan?
It's in all my free time, and the fact that when you go through medical school, your essay writing skills are very rudimentary. You sit and describe the root of a nerve or the muscle or some pathology, and therefore this is not my craft. And so it takes me a bit longer to get what I want to see or do or say. And it's evolving. I mean, I pushed it after the pager attack. I pushed it back by a year because I recognized that this is something that is very, very central to this journey, and I needed to understand that pager attack.
Yeah,
and the behavior of the Israelis and Trump and the celebratory aspect of the pager attack and giving each other golden pagers and all of that. It was critical. And so now that is ended, I'm kind of back grafting away.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I personally am so excited for it. I love being in conversation with you. But I also want to note that for me, every time I sit down with you and talk, but also what you're doing in real time right here is this practice of alignment. Like, very rarely do I hear physicians, let alone somebody at the level of your level, talk about the humility of a craft, of writing, of understanding, of ongoing study. And I'm not sort of like coming at people individually. I'm saying this as a symptom of a structure that positions physicians as all knowing, just like in psychology. Like, we need to be the all knowing people that know everything and miss a tune from the centerpiece of our work, which is the person we're working with, who there's nothing we can know about them without them.
Yes.
Right. And
Yes.
that feels like what you're saying right now feels like such an in vivo exercise of that. And I just kind of want to highlight that for folks, because I think there's sometimes a way in which we search for, okay, what's the concrete? How do I do this every day? If I'm not a physician, if I'm not a psychologist, how do I do that? I think this committed study, the refusal to be disconnected and dislocated from historical examples, from where you started, like your family, from the conditions under which we all live, from the seductions that we have around us that can hide and like feel good things. Like, NGOs feel good to people,
Yes, of course.
you know?
Saviorism is addictive.
Right.
And,
Right.
and during this war, we saw,
Right.
that white saviorism
Yeah.
exhibits itself in brown faces that grew up in the West,
Yes.
that believe that their quest to be recognized, a part of it is to exhibit white saviorism.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Wow. Well, that feels like a place we can sort of start to wrap up. Is there anything else you would leave us with? What feels critical for you? I mean, maybe on the space of not ceding anything, not ceding psychic space, not ceding anything for colonizers.
I mean, I think we need to understand that not just in terms of the clinic, but in terms of this point of history, where global capital is no longer in a position or no longer wants to come to any accommodation with us, and therefore has jettisoned the tools of liberalism and the language of liberalism, and is now dealing purely in terms of pure violence.
Right.
Pure linguistic violence, pure epistemic violence, pure political violence, and pure military violence. And therefore, we need, moving forward, to reposition ourselves. And we need, moving forward, to tell reformists that the other side is in no mood to meet you halfway, or even a quarter of the way, or even a tenth of the way. These attempts at reaching a reformist moment with global capital at the moment is not going to happen.
Yeah.
There's no Madrid or Oslo moment or Mandela moment coming up very soon. Global capital does not feel it needs to, and has been weakened so much that it cannot afford the luxury of accommodation. Democracy, liberalism, the tools of liberal global order were a luxury that global capital had.
Right.
Now it feels it no longer has that luxury, and therefore needs to deal purely in terms of violence with you.
Yeah. Yes. Yes.
And the other thing is, we have to going back to the superstructure. Global capital's biggest challenge now is surplus populations. Surplus populations that have zero economic need and need to be killed.
Yeah.
Either genocidally, as in the case of Palestine, or through social murder, as in the case of austerity measures in the global north.
Right.
Different differential between lifespans that exist in the United Kingdom, the United States. If you look at them in terms of wasted lives, i.e., if you calculate the number of people who are dying 10 years younger than the rest of the top part of the population, you count not numbers of people dying, but the number of years that have gone,
Right.
you realize that austerity is also a genocidal mechanism
Right.
of wiping out the surplus population, or at least diminishing its lifespan. Because, and so again, understanding what this genocidal moment not just means for Palestine, for the region, or even for the global South, but what it means for what global capital wants to do
Right.
with the planet and its inhabitants.
Right, right. Oh, I mean, what a beautiful invitation to us to commit to antagonism. Right. And this is the thing about not ceding space, is that if everything's a contested space, if every space is a space for the restabilization of capital, power, empire, colonialism, and the enshrinement of that, then it is what a beautiful way to kick off Psychic Militancy podcast by reminding us that actually our antagonisms are a centerpiece to this. They're not secondary, they're central.
And they're not optional.
صح.
The other side is no longer in any mood for your reformism.
Yeah. غسان يعطيك ألف عافية.
Thank you so
شكرا
much.
شكرا كثير.
Thank you.